Excerpts from the Unknown Reality, Volume 1. Within the entire identity there may be, for example, several incipient selves, around whose nuclei the physical personality can form. Session 680. When your mother died in her 50s in one probable system, your mother in this system was the recipient of energy that then returned. Session 680. All probable worlds exist now. All probable variations on the most minute aspect in any reality exist now. You weave in and out of probabilities constantly, picking and choosing as you go along. Session 681. There are, for example, parallel events that are followed as easily as you follow consecutive events. Session 681. In practical terms of sense data, those worlds do not meet. In deeper terms they coincide. Any of the infinite number of events that could have happened to you and Rupert, do, happen. Session 681. Statistics provide an artificial, predetermined framework in which your reality is then examined. Session 681. The moment point, the present, is the point of interaction between all existences and reality. All probabilities flow through it, though one of your moment points may be experienced as centuries, or as a breath, in other probable realities of which you are a part. Session 681. In no way now can you predict what will happen to you now. You can choose to accept as your reality any number of given unpredictable events. In that respect, the choice is yours, but all the events you do not accept occur nevertheless. Session 681. Needless to say, I wanted you to know that there is much more than even this, complexities that are truly astounding, intelligences that operate in what I suppose you would call a Gestalt fashion, building blocks of vitalities of truly unbelievable maturity, awareness, and comprehension. These are the near ultimate as I understand such things. Session 681. That viewpoint however is highly limited, for above you, using that scale, there are other more developed organizations of these units, and so from that more exalted viewpoint, you would seem to be junior souls indeed. Session 682. There are millions of these units of consciousness in one atom, many millions. Session 682. Even your atomic structure, then, is poised between probabilities. If this is true, then obviously you are aware of only one small probable portion of yourself, and this portion you protect as your identity. If you think of it as simply a focus taken by your greater identity, then you will be able to follow what I am saying without feeling puny by contrast, or lost. The focus that you have is indeed inviolate. Session 682. There is, of course, no single line kind of development at all. In first place, as you know, your life is at once. Session 682. At those times that the individual consciousness became so entranced with its experiences, however, that the clear-cut, steady, and conscious communication with the mass consciousness went underground, so to speak. Session 683. You rarely find a person who is a great intellect, a great athlete, and also a person of deep emotional and spiritual understanding, an ideal prototype of what it seems mankind could produce. Session 683. Any concepts of God or other beings that are based upon limited ideas of personhood will ultimately be futile. Session 683. I do not want to get involved in a discussion of levels, in which progression is supposed to occur from one to the other. All such discussions are based upon your idea of one personhood, consecutive time, and limited versions of the soul. Session 683. The flower, calling back to the bulb, urging it ahead and reminding it of its probable future development, is like a future self in your terms, or a more highly advanced self, who has the answers and can indeed be quite practically relied upon. The gods can be seen in the same light, only on a larger scale, and understood in that context. They can be relied upon. Session 683. In your terms, however, it is as if the flower to be, from its future calls back to the bulb and tells it how to make the flower. Memory operated backward and forward in time. Session 683. Reincarnation simply represents probabilities in a time context. Session 683. These units form what you think of as the mind, around which the structure of the brain is formulated. The units permeate the brain. Session 684. The body is also a pattern. While the material that composes it changes constantly, the pattern maintains its own integrity. The form is etched in space and time, and yet the pattern itself exists outside of that framework also. The body is a projection, therefore, into the three-dimensional field. Session 685. Not only can all cells respond to each other, but their mass activity triggers even higher centers of consciousness to respond to a given set of world conditions, rather than to other quite as legitimate world conditions that do not fit the accepted pattern. Session 685. These pulses or messages became the only official data that, translated into sense perception, formed physical reality. This selectivity gave an understandable line of reference from interior to exterior existence. Session 686. The necessity for immediate conscious exterior action at an indefinite point of intersection with events was left to the emerging ego consciousness. Session 686. The body, as mentioned, in the 685th session, is an electromagnetic pattern, poised in a web of probabilities, experienced as corporal at an intersection point in space and time. Session 686. The psyche knows itself and is aware of its parts. When ego consciousness reached a certain point of biological and mental competence, when experience in the present became extensive enough, then ego consciousness would be at the stage where it could begin to accept greater data. Session 686. As egotistical consciousness expands to include hereto largely neglected data, then it will experience, practically speaking, a new kind of identity, knowing itself differently. Session 686. Whether or not you have any great success, the exercise will begin a neurological reorientation that will be most important if you hope to glimpse realities that are outside of your neurologically accepted sense reality. Session 687. You deal directly with future probabilities in the dream state in any case. Session 687. On an unconscious level you are aware of your probable selves, and they of you. You share the same psychic roots, and your joint yet separate dreams are available to all of you. Session 687. The dream state, however, does operate as a rich web of communication between probable selves and probable existences. All probabilities spring from in reality, from the psyche's own inner activity and structure. Session 687. It does mean that your probable selves and you share in a body of symbolism, background, and ability. Session 687. Now, however, it must begin to recognize that it can indeed expand, and bring into its awareness other quite legitimate realities. Session 687. Man's unconscious knowledge is becoming more and more consciously apparent. This will be done under and with the direction of an enlightened and expanding egotistical awareness, that can organize the hereto neglected knowledge, or it will be done at the expense of the reasoning intellect, leading to the rebirth of superstition, chaos, and the unnecessary war between reason and intuitive knowledge. Session 687. I am saying that the individual self must become consciously aware of far more reality, that it must allow its recognition of identity to expand so that it includes previously unconscious knowledge. To do this you must understand, again, that man must move beyond the concepts of one God, one self, one body, one world. These ideas are currently understood. Session 687. Because of the ego's particular line of development, you have experimented with artificial drugs and chemicals, both in foods and for medicinal purposes, as well as for religious enlightenment. Some of the effects of LSD and other artificial psychedelic drugs give you a hint of other probable directions your consciousness might have followed, or might still follow, as the experiments are conducted. However, and in the ignorance of the framework, the conscious mind takes a subordinate position. Session 687. It is vital that you understand this inward and outward thrust of time, however, and realize that from this flows the consecutive appearance of the moment. Session 688. Even when you lost sight, as you knew you would, of those deep connections, they would continue to operate until, in its own way, man's consciousness could rediscover the knowledge and put it to use, deliberately and willfully, thereby bringing that consciousness to flower. In represent a great leap, for the egotistically fully comprehend unconscious knowledge and of its choice, he would become a conscious co-creator. Obviously this has not as yet occurred. Session 688. Yet even within your system, there are hints of the other probable realities that also coexist. The dolphins are a case in point. In your line of probability they are oddities, yet now you recognize their great brain capacity, and to some dim extent glimpse the range of their own communication. Session 688. There is even now an extremely rich emotional life on the part of the dolphins, to which you are relatively blind, and more than this, on their part a greater recognition of other species than you yourselves have. They go out of their way to help other species, and yet they do not take pets, Session 688. In other probabilities, water-dwelling mammals predominate. They farm the water as you farm the land, and are only now learning how to operate upon the land for any amount of time, as you are only now learning how to manipulate below the water. Session 688. The infant sees, out of context, both present and future without discrimination, and I am speaking of images physically perceived. Session 688. It is the body's own precognitions that allows the child to develop, to speak and walk and grow. Session 688. All animal gods hint of various experiments and species in which consciousness took different forms, in which the birth of egotistical awareness as you know it tried several areas of exploration. Session 689. The totem pole, for example, is a remnant from an era where there was much greater communication between man and the animals, when, in fact, men went to the animals to learn, and from them first acquired knowledge of herbs and corrective medicinal behavior. Session 689. Animal awareness may seem undifferentiated to you. It is however highly specific, poised in the moment, but so completely that in your terms past and future are largely meaningless. Session 689. In one way or another all mythology contains descriptions of other species existing on the earth in various forms. This includes stories of fairies and giants. For example, mythology tells you about the archaeology of your race psychically as well as physically. Session 689. In thinking in terms of consecutive time, however, evolution does not march from the past into the future. Instead, the species is precognitively aware of those changes it wants to make, and from the future it alters the present state of the chromosomes and genes to bring about in the probable future the specific changes it desires. Session 690. Because you are people, you personify what you perceive, peopleize it. Session 691. Your conscious mind tells you where you are in time and space, and directs your activity in a world of human action. That world has its own kind of rich complication, that is as unknown to the animals as much of their acute realization unknown to you. Because you have a conscious mind, then, other portions of your being rely upon it to give them an adequate picture of your situation, and to give the conscious orders for action. These orders will then be carried out. To do this, you must use that mind as completely as possible. Session 691. The entity is aware of the experiences of all of its personalities. To the entity, your own consciousness could be likened to one stream of consciousness. In your terms, the greater part of your own identity, then, is completely aware of all of your conscious and unconscious living material. It is also aware of the same kind of data from all of its and your parts. Session 692. Inherently the physical brain is capable of dealings with more than one main line of consciousness. This does not mean the development of dual personality, by the way, it means the further expansion of the concept of identity. You would not only be aware of the you that you have always known, in the same way that you are now, but a deeper sense of identity would also arise. That identity would contain the you that you have always known, and in no way threaten it. The new you would simply be more than all are now. You would just have another expansion of consciousness, another self who is aware of being in the same way that, using an analogy, granted, the writer is aware of the self who lives, in those terms, is the self who lives while being in a position of some apartness, able to comment upon the life being lived, now in a very small way admittedly. That analogy hints at the kind of deeper events that occur as selves are born out of selves to operate in various levels of activity. In the case of entities, each such self dwells entirely in its own dimension or system of reality. Session 692. I am simply saying that on your earth now there are species of consciousness, though that is probably not the best term. You have been so obsessed with exterior differences, especially of color and nationality, that you have completely ignored these other far more important variations in the form that consciousness takes in relation to physical life within your race, the race of man. Session 692. Believing such clues to be meaningless, the conscious mind does not perceive them, or calls them coincidence. Such clues in your intimate daily life, however, looked at in a different way, can tell you much about the potential of the species, and give you glimpses of other systems of reality in which human consciousness can respond. Session 693. The rich interweavings of probabilities are apparent in all of your lives if only you stop organizing your perceptions and experience in prepackaged ways. Emphatically, Session 693. If you pay more attention to what you think of as coincidences, you will discover another kind of order that underlies the recognized order you follow. Session 693. Since you perceive physically through the body, which is atomically structured, then of course your sense perceptions lead you to block recognition of other probable stimuli or actions. Session 694. In much more basic terms, all events exist at once, even as atoms and molecules appear at once in all probable positions. Session 694. You can change probabilities for your own purposes, but you cannot change the courses of other probable selves that have gone their own ways. All probable selves are connected, they each influence one another. There is a natural interaction but no coercion. Session 695. Each probability system has its own set of blueprints clearly defining its freedoms and boundaries, and setting forth the most favorable structures capable of fulfillment. Session 696. You are the judge and the final word in that regard, so that as your ideas change, as you move toward one probable self and decide upon that as your official self, you will always have a rich bank of probable actions to choose from. Session 697. The members of some ancient civilizations, including the Egyptians, knew how to be the conscious directors of dream activity, how to delve into various levels of dream reality to the founts of creativity, and they were able to use that source material in their physical world. Session 698. To use these arts requires first of all the knowledge that beneath the world you know is another, that alongside the focus of consciousness with which you are familiar there are other focuses quite as legitimate. Session 698. In a way, one remember dream can be compared to a psychological photograph, one picture that is not physically materialized, not frozen motion, not framed by either space or time. Therefore many of those ingredients appear that are necessarily left out of any given moment of waking conscious activity. A remember dream is a product of several things, but often it is your conscious interpretation of events that initially may have been quite different from your memory of them. To that extent the dream that you remember is a snapshot of a larger event, taken by your conscious mind. There are many kinds or varieties of dreams, some more and some less faithful to your memories of them, but as you remember a dream you automatically snatch certain portions of subjective events away from others, and try to frame these in place and time in ways that will make sense to your usual orientation. It will help if now and then you imaginatively think of vivid dream imagery as if it appeared in a photograph instead, as during your lifetime you collect a series of photographs of yourself, taken in various times and places, so in the dreaming state you collect subjective photographs of a different kind. Session 699. In the dreaming state, such fluctuations also happen. It should be obvious that there yon can leap from time. Much more is involved, however, for there are separate strands if you prefer, of consciousness that are naturally pursued in the dream state, and these can be followed with some training and diligence. Session 699. The picture is a relatively simple one, all in all, one in which each consciousness is assumed to be directed toward a particular focus, is ensconced in one body, with its existence bounded by birth at one end and by death at the other. Unfortunately, that picture is as limited as any one of your photographs. You are used to examining your dream state from the viewpoint of your waking condition, but sometime in the dream state try to examine your normal waking reality. Simply give yourself the instructions to do so. You may be quite surprised with the results. Speaking as simply as I can, and using concepts that you can understand, let me put it this way: from the other side, within what is loosely called the dream state there is an existence quite as valid as your own, and from that viewpoint you can be considered as the dreamer. You are the part of you concentrating in this reality. You form it through information and through energy that on the one hand has its source outside this system, and that on the other constantly flows into this system, and so in that respect the systems are united. The same applies to all consciousness of any type or variety. In a manner of speaking, then, your cells dream. There are minute variations of electrical discharge, not now perceivable, that could pinpoint this kind of fluctuation on the part of cells, and also on the part of atoms and molecules. Session 699. On different levels in the dream state, then, you are also subjectively aware of other probable realities. Session 699. In dreams you take many subjective photographs and decide which ones among them you want to materialize in time. To a certain extent, therefore, the dreams are blueprints for your later snapshots. Session 699. A sense of daring, exploration, independence, and spontaneity is required, Session 700. The true art of dreaming is a science long forgotten by your world. Such an art, pursued, trains the mind in a new kind of consciousness. A practitioner of this ancient art learns first of all how to become conscious in normal terms, while in the sleep state. Session 700. There are inner meeting places, then, interior places that serve as points of inner commerce and communication. In a completely different context, they are quite as used as any city or marketplace in the physical world. This will be elaborated upon later in the book. Our dream art scientist learns to recognize such points of correlation. Session 700. He will comprehend that he cannot isolate himself from a reality of which he is necessarily a part, and that to do so lessens at best a distorted picture. Session 700. Each physical experience is unique, and while the energy for it and the creation of it come from within, the pristine, private, and yet shared quality of that experience could not exist in the same way were it not so exteriorized. Session 701. Einstein came closest perhaps in this regard, for he was able to quite naturally identify himself with various functions of the universe. He was able to listen to the inner voice of matter. He was intuitively and emotionally led to his discoveries. He leaned against time, and felt it give and wobble. Session 701. The instruments are useful only in measuring the level of reality in which they themselves exist. Session 702. In other words, unless the ideas behind objective science are altered, then gadget-produced altered states will almost certainly be used to manipulate, rather than free, consciousness. Session 702. In as simple a language as possible, and to some extent in your terms, the electron spin determines time sequences from your viewpoint. Session 702. I have mentioned the dream art scientist and the mental physicist. I would like to add here the complete physician. Session 703. Now all of this certainly sounds unscientific to many people, yet most of my readers have already picked up a different version of the nature of science, or they would not be reading this book to begin with. The private oracle, what does that mean, and what does it have to do with the unknown reality? More, what does it have to do with the practical world? The private oracle is the voice of the inner multidimensional self, the part of each person not fully contained in his or her personhood, the part of the unknown self-structure out of which personhood, with its physical alliance, springs. Basically that portion of the psyche is outside of space and time while enabling you to operate in it. It deals intimately with probabilities, the source of all predictable action. Session 704. You believe that you need scientific paraphernalia to achieve such ends, yet many animals are aware of such phenomena, and without such instruments, mankind itself is innately equipped to foresee such potential disasters. You are as natural as an animal, and as tuned into the deep rhythms of the earth, those that you consciously perceive and those that are perceived by your body consciousness, but are screened out by the official mind. Session 704. He would encourage the patient to tune into the private oracle in order to ascertain his or her own purposes in physical life, and to reinforce spiritual strength. Session 704. Each individual is a universe in a small package. Session 704.